Good afternoon, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you so much for joining as we are about to discuss a very important topical matter. Don't we always discuss very important topical matters? Yes, we do. And I hope that you are learning from the subject matters that I am discussing and that I will continue to discuss. Now, this afternoon, we are going to look at primarily at an article that was written in the Jamaican Gleaner regarding the Ukraine war. Professor Curtis Ward, he's also a former ambassador to the United Nations, I think, from Jamaica. Let me just, whilst I am introducing here, let me just make sure that I'm saying the correct thing. And Professor Curtis Ward, many of you know him. I think he still lectures at the University of the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. So Curtis Ward is former ambassador of Jamaica to the United Nations with special responsibility for Security Council affairs. I think he might be a part-time lecturer, adjunct professor, I should say, at the University of the District of Columbia. Actually taught there one particular summer at that university, the University of the District of Columbia. Now, I would like to continue my discourse because I am sensing from Curtis Ward's article that he is on the side of the Democrats, just like he's on the side of the PNP party in Jamaica. He tends not to give a nuanced perspective as a diplomat. And this is what is lacking in our education system, the ability to be fair and to look objectively at a matter, even if it goes entirely against what you think or your ideology or your political perspective. And oftentimes we are so tethered to our political perspective, to our political philosophy, to our political ideology, that we are not able to assess anything with any amount of fairness and open-mindedness, if that's a word. I know. Now, the fact of the matter is that when you look at a man like Chris Hedges, he will always say to you, he will always say that Trump is, brainless character and that he is not tethered. He doesn't have, and he's not working with any theoretical framework. He doesn't have any ideology in which he's basing or on which he's basing his foreign policy. Now, I can agree to an extent with that sort of assessment by Chris Hedges, a journalist that I respect a lot. However, I do not agree with him that we always have to cement the real world situation with some form of theoretical framework on some sort of void and vacuous theory. Because a lot of times that is what is killing our countries, right? They are in their understanding of the world, whether it be communism or capitalism, people tend to just look at what some theorists have said about, capitalism or communism, and they think that people's real life situations are, encapsulate that. And it does not, in many cases, a minute portion does. But I would tell you that 90% of that does not encapsulate what people live, their real life circumstances and situations. And that is what we have to understand, whether it's war, whether it's economic disaster, or be it some political turmoil in a country. Oftentimes, what you have learned in school or from the books, right, from these books of theoretical books, is not what is happening on the grounds in the real world. And that is what we have to understand. Now, how do we balance what we learned in school, or what we hear on the media, right? Like, it's very evident to me that Professor Curtis Ward is an avid reader of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journals, right? And perhaps the paper from England, the Guardian newspaper. And if you are a daily reader of these papers and that's only what you read, and you read the textbooks coming from academia in the United States, you are not informed. May I repeat that? If you are a daily reader of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Jamaica Gleaner, the Jamaica Observer, the Financial Times, and I'm not suggesting that you should read them. because I read all of them too. But the fact of the matter is that I don't believe 99.9% of what they say, because they're gone. They have been captured. They're in the pockets. These news outlets are in the pockets of the United States military-industrial complex. And you say, wow, why you say that about the Gleaner? The Gleaner isn't a part of the US. Oh, yeah, it isn't? Well, it dares not challenge what the United States is doing, right? So you can say that, yes, indirectly it is, because it cannot challenge the perspective that the United States would like to diffuse around the world. So let's, without further ado, I should say, let's get into Professor Ward's article. So we have here Ukraine versus Russia, who gets to decide? This is what Professor Curtis Ward's article is titled. Now, President Donald Trump's position on the Russia-Ukraine war, he begins, simply put, is Putin gets what Putin wants. Trump's complete U-turn on U.S. policy of holding Putin responsible for the illegal invasion and territorial aggression completely reverses U.S. support for Ukraine and awarding Putin's tyranny. Now, he begins with his first paragraph tells us that he's on the side of the Ukraine. And it's more nuanced than we believe, right? And if you were to read appropriately the history, if Professor Curtis Ward was to read accurately the history, he would understand that this war has been brewing ever since the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union was dissolved, right? Ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, this war has been brewing. And you ask why? Why you're saying that? Because the United States was never happy with the fact that the Soviet Union came down. Because the purpose of the military-industrial complex is the continuation, the unending continuation of wars. Without wars, the United States military-industrial complex would not be in operation. And that is why the founding fathers spoke out particularly against standing armies. When you have standing armies, that's the greatest enemy of any state, not the Muslims, not the MAGA people, not any enemy that the United States has mentioned. Her greatest enemy, the United States' greatest enemy, is her standing armies, her military bases that are around. I think there are around over 800 military bases that the United States has around the world, which require standing armies. And as I'm suggesting, that is the greatest threat to the United States' peace and security and civil liberties. We've got to understand that. Anything that you have learned from me, forget all of those things. But this is crucial that you understand. Very important that you understand that this is the greatest threat to America's peace and security. We're not taught that because we're told that the Muslims and the communists, right, and other people, the other, and we're not looking internally. That is what we have. A lot of times, we're the problem, and not that the other person. We tend to complain about people, but a lot of times, if we should do an introspective look at ourselves, we'd see that a lot of times the problems lie with us, right? Very important that we understand that. So Curtis Ward is on board, and he thinks that Putin is getting what Putin wants, and that is not true. Putin never wanted the war, right? It is the fact that from the end to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was the agreement by Washington and Russia that NATO would not have expanded, an inch, forward from the line that they had demarcated, that they had set, right, at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But Washington did do that. They started to expand because the United States' purpose is to control the world, and she has to expand. She wants to control the Middle East. She wants to control Eurasia, which Russia is a part of. All right, and it's important that you understand that any country that wants to control the world has to control Eurasia. Any country that wants to control, any global power that wants to control the world has to defeat and control Eurasia. And that is why China and Russia are important. They are two very powerful global powers and competitors to the United States. And the United States want to weaken them, right? She wants them out of the fray. She doesn't want them as any competitors, including Europe. The United States doesn't want Europe as any competitor of any of its competitors, right? So when you think that the United States has allies, she only has interests. And I forgot to have pulled up Henry Kissinger's, very insightful statement about American friends. And I'm not quoting him, I'm just paraphrasing. He says that it is dangerous to be an American enemy, but it's fatal. It is fatal to be an American friend, an American ally. It means, therefore, that you're not America's friend, no matter what you think you're doing. To please America, she only regards you if you are fulfilling her interests and not the fact that she appreciates your friendship. Because being a bully, which the United States is, demands that you control everything. So when they talk about Trump, Trump is a symptom of the American establishment, of the US military industrial complex, where they bully you. Now, what happened, what you saw happen on Friday, what happened on Friday between the Ukrainian Volodymyr, so his name is, I'm sorry, I'm probably butchering his name, Zelensky, and Donald Trump, happens behind the scenes. These things happen behind the scenes. Right, and probably you will see even more, acrimonious words being exchanged, maybe death threats included. But the fact is that it shocked the senses of the world because this was on mainstream TV, was on the air for us to see. And Donald Trump said something which I think you should appreciate. I don't think many of us appreciate it. They say, oh, you should be diplomatic and you should smile. Because I think that that is what we have been accustomed to, for people to smile with you and behind your back, they're plotting to kill you. Donald Trump tells you in your face what's it's about. And Donald Trump said, yes, when Vance was sort of, pushing back and say, why are you allowing this to be viewed on TV? And Donald Trump says, it's good. The American people are seeing how the American president is negotiating and what the sort of recalcitrant behavior displayed by Zelensky. Because Zelensky doesn't want the war to end. Zelensky is a part of the US military industrial complex in the sense that arms are being sold, contracts are going to be ending, and all of that, and he doesn't like this. But let me be very, very, very plain and clear about what is happening in the Ukraine. The United States, whether under Donald Trump or Joseph Biden or Kamala Harris, all of them want full spectrum dominance. However, their style is different. Now, it would be in the interest of the United States to weaken Russia or to destroy Russia's power. It is in her best interest in terms of her imperial ambitions, right? So destroying Russia, as I suggested before, is in America's interest, in her imperial, as a part of her imperial undertaking. However, the way in which the Democrats wanted to weaken Putin, destroy the Russian power, the Russian global power, was to impose sanctions and also to create this war between the Ukraine, and they provoked that war, by the way, right? Because if you study what happened in 2015, it doesn't happen 3 years ago, It has been brewing since, I told you, from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And if you don't want to believe me, let me go to a quotation here. I was going to leave it for last, but I think I should begin to tell you that let's look at what is happening here. And if you have not yet gotten a hold of this book, Full Spectrum Dominance, let me share my screen for you to see the book, Full Spectrum Dominance. Yeah, Full Spectrum Dominance by William Engdahl, right? I need you to go and get yourself a copy. In fact, this is a PDF version. It's totalitarian democracy in the New World. Full spectrum democracy, sorry, full spectrum dominance, what am I saying? Totalitarian democracy in the New World Order. So we're seeing now that the New World Order is in full swing, right? And if you, those of you who think the New World Order is just some very awkward conspiracy theory, you've got to go and educate yourselves, because it means, therefore, that you are not educated if you think the New World Order. And it's not even any New World Order, it's the old world order being strengthened and being restored with greater force, because we now have technology and other things. The surveillance now is much more formidable than it was during Hitler and, you know, and all of these other major dictators. Now, listen to what the author is saying here, and this is on page 7. The collapse of the Soviet Union was inevitable by the end of the 1980s. It was inevitable. And if you read Chalmers Johnson's The Sorrow of U.S. Empire, he explains that very well, perhaps better than this author would, you know, even though their books had two different, you know, goals and objectives. But the thesis, I should have said, but the fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union was on a path of failure, because it could not compete with the United States. The United States was a much wealthier country than the Soviet Union. So when you hear that what Ronald Reagan did, because he wanted to build the power of the U.S. military empire, the U.S. military industrial complex, he had to create fear. And when they create fear in people, people believe, and then they say, well, we need more money so that we can fight against the technological power of the then Soviet Union. But that was not true. And that's what they constantly do. We saw that with Iraq, that in order for the US to have gone into Iraq, the United States had to convince its people that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which was not true, right? The economy had been literally bled to the bone in order to feed an endless arms race with its arch rival and Cold War opponent. So because they were competing with the United States, they became penniless. And that is what the United States is now doing. The United States, even though it's deemed to be the most formidable military empire in the history of humanity, but economically, it is also bleeding. Because you can't continue like that and think that it is going to be sustainable. And that is why the debt in the United States is unsustainable, not due because America is giving a lot to the world and providing a lot of aid to the world, humanitarian aid to the world, but because it is building wars and it has so many military bases scattered around the world. I hope that you're understanding and that you're learning something from this brief conversation. I can't tell you everything. So we have here that the economy had been literally bled to the bone in order to feed an endless arms race with its arch rival and Cold War opponent, the United States. By late 1989, the Soviet leadership was pragmatic enough to scrap the last vestiges of Marxist ideology and raise the white flag of surrender. Free market capitalism had won over state-run socialism. They could no longer win the war against the United States. So they decided that they would just fold their arms. Whether or not the Pope and Ronald Reagan had met and decided that they were going to be the heroes, even though they were not any heroes in terms of bringing down in creating the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but they pretended to be. And that is what is in the history books. And we read it and say, yeah, it's true. Right? It's true. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought jubilation everywhere, with the exception of the White House, where initially President George H.W. Bush reacted with panic. And you really wonder, wouldn't he be happy now that, oh, the United States has won the war? Why should he be reacting with panic? Let's continue to read. Perhaps he was unsure how the United States would continue to justify its huge arms spending and its massive intelligence apparatus, ranging from the CIA to the NSA to the Defense Intelligence Agency and beyond. By the way, Chalmers Johnson, and he was the first person I learned that from. Do you know, we often talk about the CIA and the FBI, but nobody really knows that the United States has 15 intelligence agencies that works for it. So some of them we might not even know without a Soviet foe. So the United States has to create a foe, an enemy all the time for it to justify its wars. And that is what it's doing in the Ukraine. In order to be able to destroy Russia, because the United States can't say that Russia was doing it anything before the war with Ukraine. So the United States had to provoke a war between the Ukraine and Russia, right? They had to do it. And, let me just read this and then we're going to go to another perspective because we have to look at war of global perspective. His world was one of enemy image, espionage, and secrecy, where people often sidestepped the US Constitution when national security was involved. So the more they can sidestep the US Constitution is the more that they will eventually dissolve it. And when they dissolve the Constitution, you are going to have a dictatorial, a totalitarian state. Then all of the principles outlined in the Constitution, the US Constitution, are shredded, then you are going to have a totalitarian state. And you've got to understand that. In its own peculiar way, it was a state within the state, a world every bit as centrally run and controlled as the Soviet Union had been, only with private multinational defense and energy conglomerates and their organizations of coordination in place of the Soviet Politburo, whatever it's called. Its military contracts linked every part of the economy, right? Its military contracts, let me repeat that, linked every part of the economy of the United States to the future, that permanent war machine. So every part of the United States economy is linked to what? The permanent war machine. Right? Let me just read this paragraph, this other paragraph, a few sentences from this paragraph for you to really get the context in which I'm speaking. For these segments of the US establishment, whose power had grown exponentially through the expansion of the post-World War II national security state, the end of the Cold War meant the loss of their reason for existing. Right? So they have to create wars and to diffuse propaganda surrounding those wars for the people, the population, not only the United States domestic population, but the world population, to believe what they're doing. And in the final analysis, to conquer the world. And they're not bringing about peace and democracy and security as they are suggesting. And I hope that you understand that that is a propaganda. And the United States citizens are the most propagandized people on planet Earth. They think the Chinese are, but they are. Because it is dangerous to think that you're free when you're not free. It is dangerous to believe that the United States is fighting wars to protect you when it is not. It's making you more insecure. That is where the danger lies. At least the Chinese knows that they're living in an autocratic country. They know that. But it's when United States citizens fool themselves into believing that this, grandiose, this gigantic military apparatus and empire commands the world respect, and hence we are respected around the world and we are protected. And they walk around feeling this, nonsensical sense of security, right? A security that is not there. Because if you have to create an enemy all the time to maintain this military-industrial complex, eventually the citizens will become the enemy. And we are already seeing that little by little since 9/11, that the United States citizens, that the war has reached home and that you are going to be targeted next. You're going to be targeted next. And yesterday I talked about the citizen who was deported, the US citizen, the Black American citizen who was deported from the United States to Jamaica, and that the Jamaican government, apparently, allegedly fabricated papers for him to land in Jamaica. Now that's interesting, but let's move on to what what's his name? Curtis Ward has to say. The Trump-Putin discussions on the future of Ukraine are set in the defiance of overwhelming international support in United Nations General Assembly resolutions, and the United Nations is a phony organization controlled by the US military-industrial complex, holding Putin-led Russia in gross violation of international law. Now, if you read Chalmers Johnson's book too, you will see that George W. Bush and his regime at the time, when he was in power after 9/11, said that the United States is not beholden to international law. And he said, George W. Bush, that people are thinking is now a hero, and Trump is the foe. Trump is the arch enemy, while George W. Bush is now a hero. And we forget what George W. Bush did in his 8 years of his presidency, the 8 years of his presidency. We have forgotten. But he said that the United States is not beholden to international law, and that the United States can run the show on its own. So George W. Bush, during his 8 years of presidency during his 8 years in the White House, believed in unilateralism, right? That the United States can go run the show on its own. It doesn't have to work with any global power. Seizing another country's territory by military aggression is specifically prohibited by international law, which is true. But is that true that they seized it without entering into a dialogue? That is not true, including the laws of war as defined in the Geneva Conventions and in violation of the UN Charter. No concessions should be given to an aggressor country. Trump's misattribution of the invader and the invaded, Russia being aggressor, is not based on facts. But what facts is Professor Ward talking about? The facts that come from the Democratic Party, the facts that come from the New York Times, the fact that comes from the Financial Times and the Washington Post. And I think he resides in the Washington, D.C. area, so maybe he is tethered to the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos' Washington Post, right? Now, I think that Professor Ward, with all respect, has to broaden his horizon. Professor Ward, you've got to broaden your horizon. And if you're teaching students still, you've got to give them different perspectives. And this perspective that you're giving is really shallow and biased, subjective. And that is not the hallmark of being a good professor, with all respect. You've got to provide. And even if he had aligned himself with an ideology, he should have given the perspective about the Minsk Accord, about the perspective that the fellow here has given in the Full Spectrum Dominance book, that the United States has always sought to create enemies and provoke wars so that it can justify the expansion of the military-industrial complex. But Professor Curtis Ward is not doing that, or perhaps seems to lack the knowledge as far as this is concerned. You see what's going to happen to our universities, because a lot of the professors there to behave like this. They write in this sort of way, and they feel scholastic. They think that they're so bright. and you dare not challenge them. You know, I was a part of the system, and you dare not challenge them. You dare not, because they're going to give you a C, they could probably give you an F. If you challenge the perspective, if any of Professor Ward should challenge the perspective that he has outlined, they are going to give you a C or an F. Right? Mark up your paper and tell you what cites what this person says and this other scholar has suggested when they're also not rooted in truth. But that is how the world works, right? And that is why it's not functioning well, whether economically, militarily, or politically. Our world is diseased. We need to now look at the realities and stop digging our heads into a textbook or into textbooks. Very important that we understand that. And I am a part of the system, you know, so the fact of the matter is that it is what it is. It is what it is. And even though I'm, let's say, I'm a Seventh Adventist, you know, proud Seventh Adventist, and there are things in the church I speak out against. Even, you know, because I align myself to the truth, but if they do things as what they did during the pandemic and many other things, and the way how they run their hospitals and so on, I speak out against it. You don't have to, you know, even if you belong to a family, you know, all of us belong to family unit. We've got to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of our family. And there are members in my own family who don't like me because I say that's not right. That is not right. And I say it unapologetically. Okay. Now, let us look at another perspective given by the Black Agenda report. And the Black Agenda report is a Black newspaper, progressive newspaper. I think it's based in Maryland or the Washington, D.C. area. Let me look at that report. And, and this article was written by Kimberly. Let me just share my screen if you get her name. Yeah, all right. So the Black Agenda report, and it was written by Margaret Kimberly, right? She's the editor-in-chief at the Black Agenda report. Now we can see here Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio during their meeting at Darla Palace in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Now, listen to what she opened. Look at how she is more nuanced. Look at how and she's not a Trump supporter, by the way. Some of you like when people are reporting to you and they're giving another perspective, you brand them as their Trump supporters. I am not, she's not. We must be able to acknowledge that Donald Trump has created a serious constitutional crisis while also recognizing that changing the U.S. relationship with Russia is groundbreaking and a necessity. So these are two realities and our two truths. One, yes, he's doing a lot of things that are unconstitutional. At the same time, we've got to commend him that he has done a thing that we need to have some working relationship with Russia, another global power, right? Global nuclear power. Now, it's interesting that after all of the sanctions, the economic sanctions that the Biden administration imposed on Russia, that at the time when these economic sanctions were imposed, that Russia was the 8th economy in the world. After the sanctions were imposed, Russia is right now number 4, right? The 4th economy in the world, something thereabout. Right? So it did not weaken Russia. In fact, it made Russia stronger. We've got to look at these things and we have to ask and question why. Now, do you know that the United States seized Russian assets? Seized Russian assets of about, I think, $300 billion. And I think Justin Trudeau's government in Canada got about 19 billion of that money. And that's some of the money he's now trying to use to keep the war ongoing in the Ukraine against Russia. Because, of course, Justin Trudeau perhaps benefits from the war. I don't know. I don't know why he is so bent on having the war. I am not sure why the Democrats want this war and think that Russia is. And if you noted, if Hillary Clinton had won the election in 2016. Russia was going to be number one. And instead, she lost the election, of course, and Donald Trump did not do that, or with Russia. But Donald Trump's major goal now is what? The Chinese. What I wanted to say before, and sometimes a lot of things are in my head, so let me just get my thoughts together, is that the United States understand that it is not this stratagem, this military stratagem that it was using to weaken Russia did not work. Let me stop sharing my screen here for a moment, right? The military stratagem that it used against weakening Russia did not work. So they had to change the guards, and they gave the election to Trump. They had to change it because they realized that this is not working. Biden's way of, weakening Russia didn't work, right? Now, Donald Trump, normally the Republicans are the ones who are anti-Chinese. And both are anti-Chinese, but they're the ones who are more militaristic towards the Chinese, while the Democratic Party is more militaristic, has a more militaristic foreign policy towards the Russians. Very important that you understand that. So that was Biden's task, to weaken Russia, perhaps to destroy it. He didn't succeed. Instead, Russia was strengthened. So what they have to do now, Donald Trump is changing tactics by courting Russia on the side of the West now to weaken China. Because they understand that if you have combined China, if you merge the might of China with Russia, you're going to have a serious trouble on your hand in terms of the US and the West challenging their world hegemony. So I am wondering if this is a strategy where Trump is using to soften Russia, say we are your friends when we're not, have them become a part of the what they call it, the is U7 or whatever, the G7, the G8, have them become a part of the G8, which they were before, right? I think sometimes before 2008, or thereabout, they're a part of the G8 or G7, right? And then what you do, you separate, you decouple Russia from China and leave her alone there to fight against the United States and the West. That might be a stratagem. I'm not sure. I'm sure that Vladimir Putin is, perceptive enough and intelligent enough to understand how the United States functions and works. He's a very smart person, right? And he knows the history, he understands history very well. Not only the history of his country, but the history of the West, including the United States of America. And one of the United States' fault is that they do not have a populace, for the most part, who understand foreign affairs, international diplomacy. It's a population that even doesn't understand about itself. Right? And I taught there, so I know what happened. I know how US people think. And every day you talk to them, you realize that they, for the most part, you have those who are exposed and they are not caught up in the propaganda. So this doesn't apply to all US citizens, but for the most part, the large majority of US citizens are not informed or misinformed, are propagandized, and they love it because it aligns with this whole matter that we're Americans, we're patriotic, and that the military is going to protect us. And people respect us because we have an American passport, which they understand that if they mess with us, the US is going to kick them. Right? That's the thinking, in a nutshell. That's how the average US citizen thinks. But let's go back to what Margaret Kimberley is suggesting here. And I think she is a more nuanced writer than Professor Curtis Ward. Mona finds no Trump-Russia conspiracy, proclaimed a portion of a New York Times headline on March 24th, 2019. And the Democrats lost their respect entirely with this Mueller's report and the Russian conspiracy. I don't know how people vote for the Democrats because they lost. They lost. Look at what they went through. And also with this their whole nonsense against Trump and what he did then during the election, and he won. 2 years of Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's investigation ended with a whimper after endless screeds about walls closing in on an alleged Trump conspiracy with the Russian government. The corporate media and elements of the surveillance state fed public dislike of the seemingly accidental president with false tales of, sorry, I'm finding it very difficult to keep this thing here. Let me see if I can put this up here. Oh Lord, it's not going. So I have to struggle with it. Okay, so it's telling me it's not going to go. With 4 tales of, and now it's gone. All right, let me see if I can get it back. Wow, you see how you have to deal with these things? You have to deal with these sort of false tales of, I can't see what is happening here. But let's go down further. I just need to get this done. Normally, I'm able to make it, to transfer this. Oh, okay, good. So it's not transferred now. Yeah. It takes a special level of political maturity to seriously analyze the actions of this administration. On a daily basis, Trump lurches from foolish declarations about changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to punishing the Associated Press. And as I'm continuing, please like the videos. Please ensure that you like the video and you subscribe to the channel. Punishing the Associated Press because they refuse to go along with the inane renaming. His alliance with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, is beset by lawsuits, and reliably Republican voters have buyer's remorse. Even elements of the Trump team are showing signs of division, with some agencies saying that 2 million federal workers must tell Elon Musk how they spend their workday, while others saying that they don't. But this is not what I wanted to say. Despite these numerous crises created by Trump himself, listen to what he's saying. He has a great deal of leeway on foreign policy, and he's using it to do what he intended in his first term: make a historic change in relations with Russia. Even before the 2022 proxy war, it's a proxy war, in the Ukraine began, successive presidents were engaged in decades-long brinkmanship with the Russian Federation. After the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, which we read in Full Spectrum Dominance, the United States and its collective West allies continued an expansion process that put every Warsaw Pact country in the European Union and into the NATO military alliance. And do you know that Russia wanted to be a part of NATO also, a part of the West, and they rejected him? He wanted to unite with the West in their fight against the war on terror when they, after 9/11. Putin actually called George W. Bush, and they rejected him because they don't want any friendship with Russia. What they want to see is a defeated Russia, a Russia that no longer is a global power. That is the agenda of the United States. NATO expansion and a Western-backed 2014 coup in Ukraine began the trajectory for the war, which began on February 24, 2025. Germany, in 2015, Germany, France, and Ukraine signed and then refused to implement the Minsk agreements. Please go online. I want you to go online and look up Minsk agreements and read about the history of that agreement and how it fell and whose fault it was, which would have provided autonomy and language rights to the Donbas region and provide Ukraine with security guarantees. Now, do you know that the Donbas region is a region, an area in the Ukraine that is comprised of Russian people of Russian descent, right? And the Ukrainians under, Zelensky's leadership was actually slaughtered many of them, thousands of them. And that is why Russia had to move in, to protect his people from the slaughter of the Ukrainian government. But there was going to be some sort of peace arrangement. Vladimir Putin has been calling for that. And Zelensky don't want any peace. He's on the side. He's siding with the US military-industrial complex. But the collective West was collectively dishonest. After leaving office, Angela Merkel of Germany and Francois Hollande of France admitted they never had any intention of making good on the Minsk guarantees and saw them as an opportunity to rearm Ukraine. In turn, Ukraine continued to attacks on Donbass and killed an estimated 14,000 people before Russia began what is called a special military operation. 14,000 of your people. Well, people, Ukrainians, of course, but they live in the Ukraine. Russians, of course, but they live on the Ukrainian soil. They live on Ukrainian soil. Now, none of this easily provable information ever made it into the pages of major corporate media or onto network broadcasts. While ultimately the only Mueller investigation prosecutions were for process crimes such as false statements and obstruction, the myth of Trump being owned by Russian President Vladimir Putin continued. They didn't want to show you what was happening in the Ukraine and tell you the truth. Trump left office under a cloud after refusing to concede or to condemn his supporters' rampage in the Capitol building on January 6, 2021, which is also very nuanced occurrence and event. You have to read and not accept what the mainstream media is suggesting that happened. Joe Biden succeeded him, but the Democratic Party practice of talking left during our campaign while governing right. So they tell you that they're doing this, and then they're governing just like what the Republicans do, right? So they talk left, but they governing right while governing right, I should say, once in office, soured voters who were also noticing Biden's obvious decline. The last-minute effort to replace him with a less than stellar vice president, along with a commitment to continue a US-funded genocide in Gaza, made Trump the 47th president of the United States, yet he's still heartily disliked by half the population of this country, right? And he's disliked because people are misinformed. And there are lots of unlikable traits about Donald Trump. Absolutely. Just like there are lots of unlikable traits about Barack Hussein Obama, about George W. Bush, about Joseph Biden, about Bill Clinton, about all of the US presidents that have ever lived, about me and about you. But we must be very fair and objective in our analysis. And many of our people, because we're so tethered to what we hear from the mainstream media, from the MSNBCs, from the CNNs, we cannot look beyond the propaganda. And it's very difficult to educate. Right now, I don't know how professors at universities, real professors that is, because you have a lot of 4 professors at the university level, I don't know how they educate, because how are you going to look at what is happening and think that Russia is the aggressor? And Russia has a lot of faults, but Russia is not the aggressor. Let us look at this, in comparison to Russia, Ukraine is an ant in terms of its global power, in terms of its, military might. It's like an ant. It can't be compared to Russia's strength. So why do you think Russia would just want to go in and destroy the Ukraine? For what? For what benefit? For what benefit? Right? Because it's really not a threat. The United States, wouldn't go to Jamaica if it didn't want something. Well, if it wants something, it would go there, but it's just not going to challenge Jamaica because Jamaica is an ant. It's really nothing to the United States in terms of military might. Military, economic, political might. Jamaica is nothing. Right? And, we saw what happened in 2010. It just went there, took us out, didn't take them a long time, and they killed a few people and they moved on. And they were sending, what they did, what the United States did in Jamaica in 2010 was to send a message to the Jamaican government and to other smaller states in the region and around the world. Don't mess with the United States. When the United States says what it wants, even if it defies international law, Professor Ward, we will get what we want. The only reason why Russia has not been destroyed is because Russia has strong nuclear arms. And the United States knows that. The only reason why North Korea has not been destroyed is because the United States knows that that North Korea has nuclear arms and can put some damage to it and the world. The only reason why Iran, the same thing. Right? So the United States has to play the game, has to use proxy wars to weaken these nations that have nuclear weapons, or the United States is going to find that's a challenge to put down or to destroy, to demolish. So we have to now look at things more objectively. We've got to open many sources and to expand our reading, diet, if you will. You've got to. And stop, saying the same thing, having the same friends, and you're saying the same things, you're repeating as if you're repeating the Psalm. And it's wonderful to repeat the Bible because the Bible is truth. And God doesn't have to change his mind. I am the Lord thy God, I change not. So yes, we can rehearse that, but man's words, because we are fallible, because we are fallible human beings, we're fallible creatures, we often change and we lie. God does not lie. So we can memorize scriptures, but we can't memorize even history. We have to, yes, memorize it to an extent, knowing that it too can change. Memorize the news, yes, but knowing that there are other perspectives. There are other narratives out there that I must familiarize myself with. So this I just wanted to come here and I wanted to comment, to expand, as it were, on Professor Ward's statement. And you can go and read his article in the Gleaner, because that's a typical article that would be written in the New York Times. He can share it with the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Financial Times. But the real independent media would laugh at him and say that he's misinformed and miseducated. Yes, Professor, you are. And you've got now to go and read some books. There are books in Washington, D.C. Go to a library, go to a bookstore and get some books, and on the other side, on the other perspective, and read. Read the book here, Professor Ward, Full Spectrum Dominance. And go and read Chalmers Johnson's book, and Chris Hedges' book, and all these other great writers in the United States. You have lots of them, right? Who have written about the impending dissolution of the US empire as it wages wars, as it is on a quest for full spectrum dominance. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe. Remember, now you have to like the videos, so the videos can be shared with as many people on the platform. Hasta entonces.